Nationwide anti-government protests in Jordan remain unabated for the fifth day in a row, with authorities struggling to rein in the palpable discontent. According to reports, several thousand Jordanians marched on the office of the country's outgoing Prime Minister Hani Mulki early Tuesday morning, angrily calling for the government to bin a series of proposed tax increases, which activists argue hit the poor and the middle class the hardest, communities that the protesters say have long been left behind by Jordan's ruling monarchy. On Monday, the small kingdom's Prime Minister, Hani al-Mulki, quit his position after massive calls for his resignation. Mr. Mulki's departure was reportedly prodded along by King Abdullah, the country's reigning monarch, who has grown concerned as protesters' chants for reform have shifted from the initially narrow objective of securing the Prime Minister's resignation and the ending of the proposed tax hikes to demands for greater government transparency and an overhaul of austerity economic policies. There's no doubt, as many have already pointed out, that in the back of King Abdullah's mind is the year 2011, the year of the Arab Spring protests in neighbouring countries, many of which were based on similar calls for deep economic reform. So, could we be witnessing the resurgence of a new Arab Spring in Jordan? Earlier on, I spoke to Middle East analyst Due-Gundersen to find out.
I'm not surprised that a lot of people have that on their mind. At the same time, there are several differences. Firstly, a lot of protesters have supported the king publicly and said, we support King Abdullah, but we do not support the people in his cabinet or the people in his government. So in other words, they're saying the king is good, but the people surrounding him are not. At the same time, I spoke with a protester this morning, and they said to me, we have learned, all of Jordan has learned its lesson from 2011. In other words, they have seen what's happened across the Arab world through these protests that overthrew systems and the chaos and violence that came after that. So I think that we're seeing prolonged protests because people do feel that they've had enough in terms of economic hardship, but they're not seeking to romanticize revolution and to actually overthrow the monarchy.
It was just last week that Amman proposed a new law, still to be given the green light by Parliament, that will increase taxes on employees by upward of 5% and on companies up to 40%. This is just the latest in a series of similar measures that come after Jordan secured a $723 million credit line from the International Monetary Fund in 2016. The small country's debt sits at about 95% of its gross domestic product, meaning that in order to repay its IMF loan, serious austerity measures have been imposed. It is these that protesters have taken issue with. To put things even more into perspective, electricity bills have spiked by a staggering average of 55%, and the fuel prices have risen 5 times this year alone. And if that wasn't bad enough, the massive influx of refugees from neighbouring Syria and Iraq several years ago has fueled unemployment, which now stands above 18%. King Abdullah has tried to placate the frustration, promising that big changes are coming. He hasn't, however, provided much in the way of detail. I asked Mr. Due-Gundersen whether he expects to see substantial reform in line with the protesters' demands.
I think right now what we're going to see is that Jordan might try to emphasize its linchpin status in the region. In other words, Jordan is a country that's seen as as a buffer zone against ISIS, against instability. So I think that they might, as they have done before, emphasize the protests and try to use it to leverage more aid. I think that actually may be more likely.
Whether King Abdullah and the Jordanian government will comply with the protesters' demands entirely remains to be seen. But it's clear that the malcontents intend to soldier on, with one activist being quoted widely as declaring that this is a new phase for Jordan. Matthew Aiton, Radio Sputnik.